Hello, and welcome to episode 11 of this podcast series on Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Last episode, we discussed the crucial Chapter 9, when we as readers see and hear the monster properly for the first time.
It's an important moment in the novel, as it not only challenges the statements Frankenstein has made up until this point about the brutish nature of his creation, it also triggers our entry into the third frame narrative of the novel.
Exactly. And that's what this episode is all about. We're going to delve into the monster's own narrative and consider what kind of an impact it has on the story as a whole. The monster's narrative begins with his own version of the day of his birth as he remembers it. Just like a baby, he struggles to remember it exactly, but what he does remember is an abundance of feeling. A strange multiplicity of sensations seized me, and I saw, felt, heard and smelt at the same time. And it was indeed a long time before I learned to distinguish between the operations of my various senses.
The monster describes himself as a poor, helpless, miserable wretch. Unable to separate the different senses from one another, he is overcome by it all, and sits down to weep. Immediately, Shelley is painting the monster as a creature filled with intense emotion and sadness. This stirs a feeling of pity in us as readers, and encourages us to feel dislike for Frankenstein, who abandoned the monster to feel this way.
This moment is also important because it highlights how the monster's first experience when it enters the world is the same one it will experience for the rest of its life: isolation and solitude. From the moment he is brought into the world, the monster is alone, and his realization of the depth of that loneliness drives him to tears. Already, only a few pages into the monster's narrative, he has become a far more pitiable creature than Frankenstein's narrative would ever allow.
The entirety of Chapter 10 is filled with light and fire. Having been rejected by humanity's representative, Frankenstein, the monster finds comfort in the lightness of his surroundings. There are constant allusions throughout the chapter to light and darkness, as Shelley plays with the concept of Enlightenment thinking. There's a moment when the monster finds a fire that had been left behind by beggars. Overcome with delight at the warmth of the fire, he reaches out to touch it.
In my joy, I thrust my hand into the live embers, but quickly drew it out again with a cry of pain. How strange, I thought, that the same cause should produce such opposite effects. We as critical readers can interpret this moment in a number of ways. Firstly, it could be read as a warning from Shelley about Enlightenment thinking as a whole. A constant striving towards the light will eventually lead to the searcher getting burned. It could also be an allusion once again to Prometheus, who, after sharing the knowledge of fire with humanity, was punished with eternal pain. Finally, it also serves to alert us readers to Frankenstein's future.
Let's dig into that last one. The fire is a source of light, joy and warmth, much like science was to Frankenstein. However, by pushing science to the point that he can create the monster, Frankenstein has come too close to the fire and caused himself pain. That we experience this through the parallel of the monster, rather than Frankenstein himself, is a clue to us as readers that perhaps Frankenstein and his creation are not all that different to one another, and that their fates are intertwined.
Chapter 10 is very much focused on the basic needs of humans: warmth, clothing, shelter and food. By having the monster search for these things, Shelley is making it clear to us that the monster has many of the attributes of a human. Therefore, we are made to ask, is he not deserving of other things humans crave, like community and company?
This is essentially the monster's tragedy. He wants to belong, but his outward appearance means that he's driven away by any humans who see him. This is made clear immediately after the monster wanders into a village looking for a place to stay.
I had hardly placed my foot within the door before the children shrieked and one of the women fainted. The whole village was roused. Some fled, some attacked me, until, grievously bruised by stones and many other kinds of missile weapons, I escaped to the open country.
It's out in the outskirts of the town that the monster finds a small hovel to shelter in. From this hovel, he's able to observe a nearby family, the Delacys. Structurally, this is important. After a whole chapter that revolves around the monster's abandonment, he finds a home and a family that he can observe, if only from a distance. The chapter closes with the monster listening to the old man read, but being unable to understand him because he knew nothing of the science of words.
While Chapter 10 was all about the monster's loneliness, Chapter 11 is all about the monster achieving some sense of community by closely watching the Delacy family. He's deeply affected by the realization that the family too are unhappy.
It was less strange that I, an imperfect and solitary being, should be wretched. Yet why were these gentle beings unhappy?
While the monster is unable to comprehend the reasons for the Delacy family's misery, the monster still empathizes with their position, and perhaps even takes some sense of belonging away from the knowledge that both he and these other people can all feel a similar sense of despair.
As the monster learns more about the world, he comes to realize that the seeming luxuries of the family are in fact extremely humble. While their living situations are somewhat better than his, they are still incredibly poor and live meagre lives. This chapter essentially serves as a means of reflecting the way the monster learns about society and family. For example, realizing that in stealing some of their food to survive himself, he's making their lives more difficult. Showing compassion, he vows that he will help the family to pay them back.
The youth spent a great part of each day in collecting wood for the family fire, and during the night I often took his tools, the use of which I quickly discovered, and brought home firing sufficient for the consumption of several days.
Working and foraging in the woods is a way for the monster to integrate himself into the Delacy family's lives. Continuing to observe them from afar, he begins to understand their language, at which point the rest of the chapter is dedicated to his explanation of how he learned to read and speak, in the hope that it might endear him to humans.
Although I eagerly longed to discover myself to the cottagers, I ought not to make the attempt until I had first become master of their language, which knowledge might enable me to make them overlook the deformity of my figure.
That the monster learns human language is crucial. Language and words, or rather the absence of them, can most directly place us within the realm of the other. The fact that the monster works to teach himself a human language and attempts to gain skills that will further blur the boundaries between him and humanity once again call into question whether he is truly monstrous, or a monster at all. Even the way the monster describes his attempts to learn the language are humanizing and endearing. The monster tells of how he hoped that he could show himself to be a gentle creature, whose intentions were affectionate, and, although his manners were rude, deserved better treatment than blows and execration.
Chapter 12 begins with the monster's full comprehension of language, and with it the ability to read complex texts. The texts that the monster chooses are crucial to the narrative, as it is through them that Shelley shapes the way the monster perceives the world around him. This use of texts within texts is called intertextuality, and is well worth pointing out in any critical analysis you produce in the future.
The monster learns to speak when a woman called Safi comes to live with the Delacys. When she arrives, Safi is unable to speak, but the Delacys teach her language. The monster, paying close attention, learns with her.
While I improved in speech, I also learned the science of letters, as it was taught to the stranger, and this opened before me a wide field for wonder and delight.
At this point, the monster can now not only parrot language, but thanks to the teachings of the Delacys, he's capable of speaking and thinking for himself. Once again, we see parallels between how the monster self-educates and how Frankenstein did the same at the beginning of the novel, the difference being the kind of texts they learn from.
The monster learns through texts like Ruins of Empires, about the different wars and disasters brought about by humanity. And through them he begins to question the purpose of man, and whether humanity is a force for good. The monster recounts to Frankenstein how the narratives inspired him with strange feelings. Was man indeed at once so powerful, so virtuous and magnificent, yet so vicious and base? He appeared at one time a mere scion of the evil principle, and at another as all that can be conceived of noble and godlike.
These questions lead to more, and the monster begins to understand that he is absolutely not a human, but rather a monster. That realization is a painful one.
And what was I? Of my creation and creator I was absolutely ignorant, but knew that I possessed no money, no friends, no kind of property. I was besides endowed with a figure hideously deformed and loathsome. I was not even of the same nature as man. I was more agile than they, and could subsist upon coarser diet. I bore the extremes of heat and cold with less injury to my frame. My stature far exceeded theirs. When I looked around, I saw and heard of none like me. Was I then a monster, a blot upon the earth, from which all men fled and whom all men disowned?
The monster laments his status as an outsider, abandoned and inhuman. In learning about the role of the sexes, birth and family, he recognizes that he's been created unnaturally. With no friends or relations, the only thing that has shaped his sense of being is the revulsion of others and the terrifying landscapes he finds solace in. This is a formative moment for the monster, confronting the themes of family, otherness, knowledge, and humanity. Chapter 13 continues this trend, and the monster becomes all the more attached to the Delacy family. Shelley once again invokes the Gothic trope of documents and letters to establish truth, having the monster produce letters from the family for Frankenstein to see.
That's all for this episode. Next time we'll take a look at the monster's continued development, as well as the introduction of crucial romantic texts to his life and how they influence him.
Thanks for listening.